Everybody, this is Ken McCarthy, and we're talking with Ashley Grogg. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks so much for having me back, Ken. I appreciate you.
And Ashley is one of the nurses in What the Nurses Saw, and you can read her whole story in the book. It's fascinating. She started out on a farm in Indiana, correct?
Yep, that's right.
Yep. And had a lifelong desire based on family experiences that she had early on to become a nurse, and she followed that path. And we've been interviewing on a variety of topics now. And one that we didn't have time for the last time, what was really important, is the concept of moral injury. And let's talk about what the classic, accurate definition of moral injury is. And then let's talk about how it possibly may be being misused by certain forces. So what is moral injury and who does it apply to?
Well, right now, if you look at the science, the science will tell you it's primarily in war veterans and quote frontline workers. So your doctors, nurses, um, even your essential workers that were in the grocery stores and things like that, social workers, it's starting to be studied there, which is a really interesting thing. But it's my belief and observation that moral injury is part of the human experience. We live in a morally unjust or morally difficult world. And we have a variety of different moral values. What's acceptable to one person is unacceptable to another, and so on. And so it makes these decisions and situations very difficult. So, at a very high level, moral injury is when a situation arises that goes against your moral beliefs. And as a result of that, you carry guilt and shame. Okay, so you feel guilty or shameful over what you did, didn't do, were forced to do, maybe be betrayed by somebody in a position of authority. Those things can all contribute to moral injury. So it's really complex and it can get really confusing. But once you start talking about it and once you start seeing it around you, you're like, oh, that makes perfect sense. This was a difficult situation that we lived through. There wasn't really a good choice or option, or it was very difficult to make the right choice or option.
Mhm. Mhm.
And now I'm associating myself as a bad person instead of maybe making the wrong decision or whatever the case may be.
Mhm.
So it's something that happens, goes against your moral beliefs, and then you carry that guilt and shame. And we have moral distress all the time. That's what makes you a good person. That's what helps you make good decisions, is that pressure and that concern over being morally and ethically sound in your decision making. And I think for me, one of the biggest things is I see that this being used to in the wrong way rather than encouraging people to heal and to learn from these situations and to do better the next time. It's being normalized and saying, well, you didn't have a choice, so it's okay, sweetheart, just keep going, it's
Mhm.
okay.
Mhm.
you know and it is okay. You need to find forgiveness, but you also have to have that sense of doing what's right and learning from those mistakes and finding that place of moral stability so that way you don't continue to perpetuate these cycles.
So one of the issues is, we're all human and we're all going to make mistakes, and we're all probably going to find ourselves in situations that we're over our heads, and we may do the wrong thing. The question is, do you acknowledge that it was wrong and do you stop doing it? Or do you say, well, it's just a psychological phenomenon and here's a psychological band-aid to put on it so you can go back and do more of it for us?
Yeah.
So when we say moral injury, we have to be careful who's doing the talking about it and what are they actually talking about. So I think we can probably imagine the others, I'm going to call them the other side. They know that they are running a corrupt system. In the case of COVID, they know that they are enforcing protocols, both denying service and giving treatments that don't make sense. And they know that they're doing it, and they know they're injuring and killing people. And the people doing it are obviously distressed, and they're telling them, well, this is just part of life. Just, I know it's uncomfortable, just keep doing it. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about ethical an ethical discussion of moral injury. But we acknowledge that that side exists. So let's talk about the ethical side, the side that actually has as its intention to help human beings. Well, there's an interesting concept, right? For a change, right? So what if we wanted to help people and improve our society? How would we approach this issue of moral injury? Let's use a concrete example since we're talking about the book What the Nurses Saw. Let's talk about the nurses situation. But as you pointed out in our pre-interview, that this applies to everybody, every field. There's certain fields like
Every human.
yeah, if you're an infantry soldier, you're probably going to be confronted with a ton of moral injury. People that are dealing with life and death, which is what nurses and doctors do, they are going to be confronted with a lot. So maybe if you're the postman, maybe not too much moral injury, but you might still have some. But certain professions which we depend on sometimes, are put in the place where there's a great potential for moral injury to occur. So it's not just doctors, nurses, it's everybody, but we're going to focus on nurses, and hopefully everybody will be able to extrapolate to their own life. So how did moral injury come into play with the COVID, what I call the COVID panic, COVID catastrophe?
I think looking at the book, every single person that you interviewed, it's clear that they experienced moral distress and they made an active choice. Whistleblowers. You talk about having some guts, right? You're stuck in this very difficult situation where you're faced with um, calling out the wrongs that you're seeing, or potentially, most definitely, losing your job, being ostracized, and making that distinction and saying, okay, either way I go, this is going to hurt.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If it's going to hurt either way, either I am stuck with living and knowing that I'm watching people, be killed, or that we're not reporting adverse events and reactions, and we're perpetuating this cycle of an unsafe product being administered, or remdesivir, any way you slice this. You're witnessing this, you're seeing evidence as it is occurring, and you have to make the decision to fight against the machine and stand up and say what's right, with the risk of nobody listening, losing your professional credibility, losing your financial stability, and all the fallout that can ensue after that. Relationships, familial relationships, marriages, all these things can really take a toll. And so it is a very impossible situation. And we saw this with the average person, even choosing, do I get the COVID vaccine or do I not? That can be moral injury. Do I have my mom get the COVID vaccine or not? Mom doesn't get the COVID vaccine and then all of a sudden gets COVID and has a terrible experience, long haulers or death or whatever. You're going to carry some guilt and some shame over that. But you have to recognize, okay, I did the best that I could in that situation. And I think the one way that this can really be positively used for those who didn't do what the nurses in What the Nurses Saw did. They chose that, other difficult path of just shutting up and going along to get along. The redemptive properties of moral injury is that you always have that opportunity to stop what you're doing, to weigh things out, decide what is in line with your moral beliefs, and then take those steps to live that out in your life. So, first of all, having hope that you can make that difficult decision, believing that forgiveness is possible, that your life can go on even if you do face some of the hardships of living in that moral route, that there is more after this, acknowledging the harm that you've done to people. I'm sure that I remember very clearly watching Nicole Sirotek's video of her just having that complete breakdown. She was living with this serious moral distress, and she had to make a decision, and she made the right decision by coming out and saying, look, this is what's happening. I don't know I don't know what's right, what's wrong, but this does not look good and we need to figure this out. And
Mhm.
that took a lot of courage, but I'm sure that was very liberating for her, and gave her the opportunity to do so much more. But acknowledging what's happening, admitting to yourself, what are my moral values and how do I live in congruence with them? um, and looking at how all of these things are going to impact you. What would have happened to Nicole if she had kept her mouth shut?
Yeah. One of on that topic, one of the nurses, oh gosh, Sarah from Canada, she had disclosed that she'd had, quite some serious mental health problems as a younger person, substance abuse and so on, and that she had straightened herself out, and that one of the ways she stayed healthy was by telling the truth about things. And that being in that situation and being forced to essentially live a lie by, you're a nurse, but you're not doing the right thing. She realized she couldn't do that. It would make her ill. It would undo her. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
it kind of sucks your soul out of your body. Pre-COVID, I had that experience in healthcare. It was working in allopathic medicine. I would describe it as sucking my soul out because I couldn't provide the care that I wanted to provide. I knew that because of poor staffing, I was probably hurting people and I would have nightmares. And in my book, I talk about, it's not published yet. I'm still working on it. But in my book, I tell the story. That's how I open, is I tell one of these nightmares and it's recurring. And I have not worked in the hospital for, I think, almost 10 years now. And I still have nightmares about it.
Wow.
So imagine I have done things, everything that I do now is, it's not repentance because I've forgiven myself. I know that I'm forgiven. I know, God doesn't expect me to be perfect, but it's all an effort to fix this situation so other people don't have to suffer the way that I did. You know, we had this massive rise in suicides of nurses, and you saw how much that affected any of these whistleblowers. You see how much it affects them to their core, that they had to witness that. And there's always going to be that idea of, could I have stopped one death had I done it sooner?
Right. We've probably all, or many of us have had an occasion where someone in our social circle killed themselves. And you say, oh God, I wish I could have helped. I didn't know it was that bad for them. And you would have done anything if you could have to help them, but they didn't let on. And then next thing you know, they're gone. By the way, you just mentioned something that I only just, I mean, you have to write a book to begin to learn about the subject. Uh, Suicide, nurse suicides. You just mentioned that there was an increase in them. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is a topic I only just discovered yesterday.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know how
Yeah.
ignorant I could be, but I am.
It's definitely been a significant problem. And I think so. If we go back pre-pandemic, nursing is a very difficult profession. You're emotionally invested. It's a calling. We've talked about this, and I was very honored to have, nursing in the heartland, and I took that as a couple different meanings. I'm in the heartland, right? But also I'm in the heartland, and it is a calling. This is a calling, and you're here most likely because of personal experiences, because you have that care and compassion for others, and so it's impossible to not go in and to relate to your patients, to feel for them, to become invested in those situations. And burnout is something that's been talked about for years. And this is what's interesting, is moral distress, moral injury is a topic that goes back to the 80s.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah. It was written about back in the 80s, but I think they rephrased it and they started calling it burnout,
Oh, that's
because
right. That's when
then
that phrase began too in the 80s.
it wasn't a problem with the system and the way that things were done. It was a problem with the nurse.
Hmm.
Okay. And so if we look at this, we have to really separate the idea of burnout and moral injury, because it's the process in which things happen. And in a lot of cases in nursing, there's gonna be nothing that you can do to prevent a bad outcome.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
But when we have these situations, when we're not taking care of ourselves properly, either mentally or professionally, working through some of these issues, it builds up very quickly. And it is very difficult to handle the thought of having some sort of responsibility in the loss of somebody's life, their suffering, um, witnessing and experiencing the suffering of the family of patients. And so that all comes together and is very difficult. And it potentially promotes the risk of suicide in these populations. But then you come into the era of COVID, the staff was already short. The staffing
Right. Right.
shortage was a massive issue long before COVID came along. And then you have this increase, plus you have the stress of the fact that you're concerned that you're going to take COVID home from your family, you're socially isolated, you're being told as a nurse, and if if the fear has not shut off your brain, you're recognizing that wearing a bandana is not going to stop COVID and you're putting yourself at risk. So am I going to die by taking care of these people? Am I going to kill my family? I'm not seeing my family. I'm working in a very high stress situation. Maybe I'm recognizing that the protocols we're using aren't helping. Maybe I'm recognizing that the medications I'm using are actually causing harm, and there's nothing that I can do about it. That breeds this.
And that in fact turned out to be true, because whether you stayed or were fired, spoke out or didn't speak out, they were just ramming this stuff. The system was just ramming this stuff down people's throats, and still are to this day. I mean, we're recording this on December 29th, 2023. They're still doing all this. So yeah, I mean, I'm gonna give what may seem a trivial comparison. If I have a car and something just goes wrong with the engine block, and that's the end of the car. It's kind of the mechanic feels a little bad for me. I feel a little bad, but we're talking about human beings that nurses are working with. This is, and things will happen medically where there is nothing that can be done. The situation cannot be fully redeemed. It's going to go badly because it's a bad situation. Well, that you can't just say, oh, well, it's a car,
Oh,
you find
shucks.
another one, you know. So it's we need to know about this profession and related professions, that people are not only bringing their skill and their diligence, they are bringing their heart to it. And it's a hard thing to handle. Well, moral injury.
Yeah.
And we're talking about genuine moral injury. We're not talking about the proliferation of videos that I've seen, all made during COVID, interestingly enough, telling nurses, just keep your heads down, don't worry about it. This stuff is normal.
Well, and that is true moral injury. You are experiencing moral injury. The error, the falsehood comes in the sense that you need to keep your head down and keep going, because as long as you are living incongruently with your moral beliefs, you will continue to incur more moral injury, and it is going to be more damning. And just like with anything else, you know, it's hard to get rid of that excess. The more work you have to do, the harder it is to get to the end. You still have to work through all that. So there's also, as you layer that moral injury on top of each other, not only did you do something wrong once, but you continue to do it. And so it compounds and it grows exponentially. And that reinforces the beliefs that it wasn't your action that was erroneous or the situation that was erroneous. It's you. You are a bad person. And we have to stop living out of congruence with our moral beliefs. We have to be liberated from the thought that it's okay to do wrong and continue to do wrong. And this is across society as a whole.
Right.
You
This is
know,
certainly not limited to nurses, that's for sure.
Yeah, so get back into congruence with your belief system, and that can be difficult. With my time in the hospital, I was faced with multiple ways that I was facing moral injury. You know, I could stay in this terrible situation where staffing was awful, where patients weren't getting the care. They were going days without baths. This isn't a hospital. This isn't in a nursing home. You know, the call lights would go off forever. They would be messing their beds because they couldn't get out of bed and they feel horrible about it. And they're apologizing to you. And I'm sitting here going, Mrs. Smith, you couldn't help it. I'm really sorry I couldn't get here. I was in the other room and I couldn't make it to you. And then they feel bad. The patient feels bad because they're making you work harder and they know that you're short staffed because you're running around like a crazy person and you haven't eaten, drinking, or peed in 12 hours. And so it's this perpetuating cycle of like, my patients don't want to ask me for help because they see how busy I am, but I want nothing more than to love them, to truly love them and care for them, and I can't. So you have that aspect. You have the aspect that legitimately there were nights that I was dealing with multiple medical crises, and I'm one person. I have 6 patients. If you divide an hour by 6, that's 10 minutes apiece. That doesn't account for being in and out of rooms and everything else. It's mind blowing when you're dealing with high acuity patients. And
And
so,
I'm sorry, and the situation hasn't been made better by the fact that, they're making it harder to become, the educational opportunities are being reduced. Less nurses are being trained. They're trying to squeeze every last drop of blood out of the nurses they do have. They're firing nurses for, insubordination or not getting. So, yeah, and I just want to, this is a small detail, but New York State cut 1/3 of its medical beds in the last 20 years. What did they think was going to happen if we ever had any kind of bulge of medical problems? So the nurses and everybody else in the hospital was literally put in an literally impossible, not, oh, it's really difficult. No, 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 literally impossible. Like you would have to transcend the laws of time and space
in physics,
and physics, right? To be able to do what the nurses were asked to do.
and
Uh,
that's pre-pandemic.
that's
And
pre-pandemic. And
so,
whose fault is that? I mean, that's the system's fault, honestly.
but on top of that, so people would say, why don't you just leave? And I look at them and I think this is important because, and this goes into other jobs as well. You know, we have retail workers that get treated like, the scum of the earth, and they're providing a service that is much needed. But if I were to leave that job, and this is one thing I really struggled with, I was perpetuating my own moral injury by staying there and not being able to do it. I was being betrayed by the authority figure in that situation, the hospital system. But if I left, I knew that they weren't going to replace me. So my coworkers were going to be even more short-staffed, and the patients were going to get even worse care. So I'm sitting here and I'm incurring more moral injury because of the patients that I don't even have yet, that I know that are going to suffer by my not being there. And my coworkers who I love, who you grow these tight bonds because you live through hell together, are going to be left with one less nurse. So instead of having 6 patients, they have 7 and 8, and that is that whole process. And if we look at the same thing with whether or not to take the COVID vaccine, I don't, if you're an individual making this decision, regardless of what background, what job is requiring it, you have to make that decision between supporting your family, paying your bills, putting food on the table, and getting a product that's untested. And, now we know that it doesn't work.
Mhm.
So moral injury is just such a wide thing. But again, it comes down to standing in your moral beliefs and refusing to step outside of them and continue to speak out. And one of the things that I did while I was in the hospital was I legitimately was on every committee in that hospital. Legitimately. The CEO and I got into a little tiff. He was at a meeting. He made some promises. I stood up for him. Several months down the road, he started pointing back at the nurses and blaming the nurses for what was happening in the hospital. And I stood up and I said, listen, I was like, you came here and you promised us these things, and that has not happened. And now you are blaming us for what you are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And he looks at me and goes, well, why don't you join a committee? We have several that could help with this problem. And the director of cardiac services, in front of a whole auditorium of nurses and other staff members, stands up, taps him on the shoulder, and says, actually, she's on every committee. And his face turned red and he changed the subject quicker than all get out.
Yeah.
And there was nothing else that I could do in that position to make it better.
Yeah.
But rather than resigning myself, now I'm working on cultural change. And that's the key. We have to have hope. And this is part of my Heal Me document. You can download it free on my website. Um, Having hope that change can occur. And then going through these different steps and continue to work towards that cultural change, because the more people that stand up and say, no, I'm done compromising my moral beliefs. We're going to stand together. We're going to fix this. We're going to do what's right by our fellow man. And we're going to fix this, because if we don't do that, if we just put our heads down and keep going, that is when the moral fiber of humanity is destroyed. And that's really what I'm worried about. And that's why I'm writing this book and talking about moral injury in this way, because if we allow that to happen, if we allow these immoral actions to be normalized and accepted, we lose. We've lost the battle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what is the name of your website where people can get the document that you're talking?
Yes. Thank you so much. It's WTAjourney.com. WTA Journey. Wellness Through Awareness is what those initials stand for. A pop-up will show up and you'll be able to enter in your email address and then click download. You'll get the PDF. You can also find it under the moral injury tab. So anytime you go to that website, it'll pop up. I try to keep it really simple. It's 6 letters, Heal Me. H stands for hope. You have to believe that healing can be possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And really just kind of reminding yourself of why you're doing this. Because if you don't believe that healing is possible, you're never going to get there. And if you don't have enough hope, come borrow some from me. Let's talk. I'll help you through it, because it is possible. It is a journey, but it's possible. And then E is for expose. You've got to admit to yourself what you did or what you were forced to do or what happened to you,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know, and that's difficult. But acknowledging those things, if you don't acknowledge it, you can't forgive yourself. You can't seek forgiveness from others. Um, and so you do have to acknowledge it. And then assess is the A, so HEA. Assess how moral injury is impacting your life.
Mm-hmm.
Is it guilt? Is it shame, fear, anxiety, depression, self-loathing? Is it, I could have done this? Is it those memories that replay in your mind and torment you? And just feed into that whole idea of not being good enough or being immoral or just wrong. Some people overcompensate. And so like I became so very rigid and militant in my nursing because I knew I could control what I was doing. And if I was perfect, then I could help prevent injury to my patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I hurt other people emotionally as a result because I was very hard-nosed and rigid. And I've had to ask that person for forgiveness. And she's so filled with grace. I call her Kay in the book. She said, Ashley, you made me a better nurse. And she goes, her daughter was ill. She goes, if my daughter was ever in the hospital, I wanted her to have a nurse like you because I knew you wouldn't let anything happen to her. And she goes, because of you, I am the person I am to get today. But I know that I made her cry. And that's not a good thing either. Like, I'm human. I'm full of flaws as well. But these are the things that we need to look at. And I'm thankful that she's so forgiving because it was difficult to face. I knew it was because I was hurting myself and fearful myself, but that's still not an excuse, right? We need to come into congruence with our belief systems. And then, so you assess what's going on, you figure out, how can my life be better? What am I holding on to? And then L stands for let go. Talk to a friend, a trusted mentor, somebody who can show you compassion.
Yes.
And we talked about compassion, I think, in our last interview, the definition of compassion, and just being present with the other person, not necessarily telling them, oh, everything's going to be okay, you're forgiven, magic has happened,
Hmm.
but just giving them that space and allowing them to go through whatever they were feeling, whether you agree or not, but letting them have that time to work through their issues, to witness your suffering and to embrace you and support you through that. And then the M is mend. So you seek that forgiveness. Are you forgiving yourself? Are you asking somebody else for forgiveness? Maybe you can't ask the individual that you harmed for forgiveness. That's a very real possibility in many cases. And so, is it writing a letter and burning it? Is it doing some of these other things to help find forgiveness and understand that in that situation, you did the best you could with what you had, and we are human, and kind of coming to terms to that, and then evaluating, because that's the last, step. I have had several instances of moral injury, and as I share, or the L part, let go, as I tell my stories, I uncover things that I didn't know that I was still
Mm,
harboring guilt and shame over.
sure.
And so evaluating and kind of walking through these steps, and it's kind of this constant, and I hate to use the term self-awareness, but it's constant self-awareness of what you're going through, how you're living in congruence with your moral values, and the situations that helped you develop those, belief systems or whatever. So it's definitely been an interesting journey to work through these things. And I think if we can recognize that moral injury happens, that it is a normal part of human existence, but the most important part of identifying moral injury and healing from it is preventing those situations from happening again. It's living in congruence with your moral values, and working through those things.
This is great. And I'm hoping that somehow this video and some of the others, but this one in particular, will get to a lot of nurses in particular that are wrestling with this, because they may not have ever heard these things before from anybody. And it's a very important thing. It hadn't really occurred to me until the book was done and out, how many wounded nurses there are from this experience. And you mentioned there was an increase in suicide among nurses. This was before COVID or during, or both?
It was during and after. The immense amount of pressure. I mean, nursing is tough, as I said, to begin with. And then you add all these extra stressors on top of it, and feeling like you have no control, no escape, no way to get out. That is demoralizing. I mean, a lot of these nurses, I think, couldn't see a way to find forgiveness for themselves for the actions that they were taking. And so they took their own lives. I mean, they're being put in impossible situations, and then that was amplified by COVID. And it truly, I mean, what do you do? It's
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
an extreme feeling of helplessness.
Do we have any like stats that we can go to look at and see that there was an increase in suicides or among?
I don't personally have any statistics. I haven't really dove into that, but you've heard it on the news. I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
they
So it
they
has.
talk,
Okay.
yeah, it has been discussed, not very heavily, but I remember there was an article out of Ohio. Um, it was an obituary, I think, or a letter that a nurse had written to her employer
Wow.
about this whole thing, and it has been briefly discussed, but it's kind of one of those under the radar type things. But suicide has definitely increased in the nursing profession because they're in impossible situations.
Wow.
And if you think about it, the it's not just the professional stress, but it's the personal stress because most of these people have student loans, you know, maybe this is their second career. That happens a lot in nursing now. And so do they have student loans from a previous career and then from nursing? And so they feel like they're kind of stuck and they can't leave that field because they have to be able to pay off that debt and feed their families and, you know, all the things. So,
Yeah, I mean, I just heard yesterday I was on a call and someone just mentioned, yeah, we're going to a memorial tonight for a nurse that committed suicide over COVID, over the COVID thing. And this is, again, this is December 29th, 2023. So these wounds are not going to go anywhere without treatment. I don't mean medical treatment, but the kind of psychological treatment or emotional treatment or life treatment that Ashley's talking about. So you've got a book coming out, or you're working on a book, and believe me, I know it's not an easy task. Do you have a title for it yet, or you just still in the
it,
process?
initially, it was going to be moral injury, the dangerous undercurrent of COVID.
Okay.
Um, because I do think that this is something that is wide sweeping across society. It's a global problem. But the more I got into the book, I I was watching TV and I would see instances where moral injury is depicted on TV.
Mm.
Our movies are filled with depictions of moral injury. And I think that just goes and speaks to the nature of, okay, this has been around forever and it is part of the human experience. We have tough moral decisions and we use art and the movies
Hmm.
to find ways to heal and cope with those things.
Bless
And
you.
so, thank you. It's kind of a disservice that's only being addressed in these very few populations when it's happening in everyday life.
I don't know why, but I had three quotes at the beginning of the book. One was from Carl Jung, who's a psychiatrist. One was from Aaron, and the third, talking about entertainment. This is some really old entertainment. This is from Sophocles. I don't even know. I mean, it's more than 2,000 years ago. And the quote is, "All men make mistakes, but a good man yields when he knows his course is wrong and repairs the evil. The only crime is pride." And part of it is realizing you're not perfect, and gee, it would be nice if I hadn't made this mistake, or if I hadn't got swept up in this thing, but I did, and now I've got to make amends somehow. I mean, maybe you can make amends to the individual person, maybe you do it through other ways, but you also have to pay attention to the healing of yourself. And you made a point that somebody else actually made earlier today. I was interviewing somebody, and she said, well, bottom line is it was hard to speak out. It was hard to lose my career and have to go back to zero, materially hard. But she says, I couldn't be happier. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. She said, the word she says, I'm free.
Yeah,
And
that liberation.
yeah, so maybe that's a word of encouragement to people who are struggling with this. There is another side, and I haven't seen anybody yet who regrets standing up, saying no, and saying I'm not going forward with this anymore. I haven't met anyone that regrets it. It may be difficult, but I haven't met anybody that's destroyed by it or injured by it emotionally. They're liberated by it.
I think it's really complex and I think it is incredibly liberating, but you still have to deal with the consequences of your actions. And sometimes that can be a real struggle. It takes a tremendous amount of faith. And one of the things that I work through, and really when I had known that moral injury existed and I thought it was an interesting phenomenon.
Right.
But I was sitting in Minnesota at a conference and it was a medical freedoms conference and I was presenting on the VAERS project. And one of the other speakers had said, oh, people with degrees are just so smart, or something to that respect. And basically said that they lose common sense and they just follow protocol medicine, which is totally true. And I laughed, thought it was funny because it's true. And then it started eating at me and my heart broke because I'm a nurse I run a medical liberty group, medical freedom group, advocating within the legislature for change to protect people's rights to accept or decline, you know? And I do this sacrificing a career because I know it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not, I'm not looking for accolades or pats on the back or anything like that. Our family makes significant sacrifices so I can do this. And I'm one of those people with degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And it just kept on eating at me. And finally I spoke up, and there was this very real, raw moment. And it was Robert Scott Bell, amazing man. He held space for me and he allowed me to walk through that journey. And that's when I realized the depth of my moral injury, not only in relation to the other aspects of nursing, but in relation to the fact that I probably have hurt or maybe even killed people by administering vaccines to patients while they were sick, acutely ill, into the hospital, send them on their way with a pneumonia and flu vaccine out the door. And I have to live with that. And the fact that my profession is promoting this, my profession is being used as a weapon against people because people trust nurses. And that was an amazing revelation. And I'm so thankful. But in that time, I talked about what it took for me to get where I am. I had to come to terms that there was a problem. I had to realize that, I had hurt people, deal with the guilt and shame of that. I had to recognize that my profession was either unaware, ignorant, willfully, or not, or there were people that in my profession and in my field were willing to harm people and hide it from them. And then you start to question, what other areas of my practice have gone wrong and how else have I hurt people?
Mm-hmm.
Statin drugs. What treatments are we using that are causing harm to people? We're not actually helping them, we're hurting them. And you have to go through that. Then you have to walk through all the hurdles of, I'm going to be ostracized politically, professionally. I may lose friends and family. I'm going to be, I was the person that people came to when they needed help. If somebody had a question, they would come to me. That's who
Mm-hmm.
I was. But when I talked about vaccines, I was crazy,
Mm.
you know? And so you have to, as a professional, work through that. So there are a lot of steps, and it's not going to be easy. But you're right, they're not going to regret it, because the fact that you don't have to live a lie and you're no longer, degrading your moral fiber and who you are as a human being, that is priceless.
You're really getting to the root of what it's going to take to transform our system. It's kind of easy to think, well, if we just get the truth out, that will be enough. If we get some policy improvements, that will be enough. What Ashley's describing here is it. This is what needs to be done on a person by person basis, and let it begin here. And with what Ashley's saying and the book that's going to come out, I want to encourage you to keep on that book, because books do become an organizing principle, and a lot of people will come out of the woodwork, and you'll have more opportunity to present these ideas to more people, and people can hold. It's a funny thing. You hold a book in your hand, and it gives you comfort, and it gives you something to go back and study and ponder, and it will be a great tool for healing for many, many people. And we have to heal our healers for the terrible system and the terrible situation they have found themselves in, if we're going to change the system that we're in. So Ashley, wow. So glad that we met, and that I said, hey, we need to do more interviews, because you really covered something just absolutely fundamental, that goes to the root of everything.
So I want to add one thing before we go.
Okay.
The reason that story with Robert Scott Bell and my recognition of my own moral injury and all the steps that it takes to get through, we have to understand is that's what builds cognitive dissonance. And if we want to break down cognitive dissonance and have a chance to heal, like you said, it really is where it starts. And so when I talk about compassion, this is why. Coming to these people with knives and daggers is not going to change their mind. They're going to dig into those beliefs even more. But if we can come to them with compassion, we can listen to their stories, we can support them and love them. that's where we're going to see real change. So I'm super excited to be able to talk with you and all of you out there, and share this. And I'm working diligently, but for now, please go download this free resource, Heal Me, on moral injury. Share it with everybody you know, because the goal here is to bring healing to the world, to restore the moral fiber of humanity, because it is worth it.
Gotcha. And that website again, where people should go to get that is WTA?
Yeah, journey.com.
WTAjourney.com. And we've been talking to Ashley Grogg. And thanks again, Ashley.
Thank you. I appreciate you.